Chapter 1 Invisible. Neil Blackwood stared at the uninviting Preston family mansion looming before him. 5 years of marriage to Olivia Preston Blackwood, and her family still looked at him like something they'd scraped off their shoes. The Thanksgiving invitation had arrived with his name conspicuously absent, but Olivia insisted they attend as a family. "Daddy, are you okay?" 8-year-old Mia tugged at his sleeve, his eyes, filled with concern. "Sharam's sweetheart," Neil forced a smile, "just thinking about all that turkey we're about to eat." Olivia was already halfway up the walkway. Her designer coat and manicured nails a stark contrast to Neil's department store jacket. She'd changed since her parents had finally worn her down, started seeing him through their eyes. As they entered, Richard Preston, tech magnate and patriarch of the Preston Empire, barely acknowledged Neil's existence. His wife, Vivian, offered a perfunctory cheek kiss to her daughter and granddaughter while giving Neil a look that could freeze hellfire. "Olivia, darling," called a voice from the parlor. Jackson Lloyd, Olivia's ex from her college days, emerged with a glass of scotch. The son of Richard's business partner and now the COO of Preston Technologies, Jackson had been a fixture at family gatherings for months. Neil wasn't stupid. He saw the lingering glances between Jackson and Olivia. Dinner was a performance in psychological warfare. Richard dominating conversation about million-dollar deals while Neil, a freelance app developer with modest success, was positioned at the far end of the table. His self-taught coding skills and community college background were frequent targets of gentle ribbing. "So, Neil," Richard's voice cut through conversation. "Still playing with your little computer games while my daughter supports you?" Neil swallowed his pride. "My development work is going well, sir. I'm finalizing an application that—" "Save it for someone who cares," laughed Richard's brother Dale. "Some men just aren't built to provide. That's why we were concerned when Olivia brought home her project." Mia's small voice piped up. "My daddy works really hard." "Of course he does, sweetie," Vivian condescended. "Someone has to keep the couch warm." Neil noticed Jackson's hand under the table resting on Olivia's thigh. When she didn't move it away, something inside Neil hardened. Later, as Neil helped clear dishes, the only man doing so, he overheard Richard and Vivian talking with Olivia and Richard's study. "We've tolerated him long enough, Richard. His story. Jackson is ready to step in. The divorce papers are drawn up." "What about Mia?" Olivia asked. "We'll make sure she gets the press and upbringing she deserves," Vivian replied. "Not influenced by worthless trash." Neil's hands trembled as he stepped away. In the living room, Mia was showing Jackson her drawings. When he dismissed her to take a business call, Neil saw the hurt in his daughter's eyes. That night, Neil didn't confront Olivia. Instead, he waited until she fell asleep. Then went to his home office. The application he'd been developing for 2 years, Neurocom, an AI communication platform, had just drawn interest from several investors. But rather than accept their modest offers, he made a decision that would change everything. Neil looked at a photo of Mia on his desk and whispered, "They have no idea what I'm capable of." Chapter 2 The Architect of Shadows. 6 months before Thanksgiving, Neil had discovered the affair when he borrowed Olivia's laptop and found intimate messages between her and Jackson. Instead of confronting her immediately, Neil began gathering information not just about the affair, but about Preston Technologies. Neil had always been different. Growing up in foster care after his parents died in a car crash, he taught himself coding as an escape. His mind worked in patterns others couldn't see. What the Preston saw as a disadvantage, his outsider status, was actually his strength. He didn't play by their rules because he never learned them. Neil's app, Neurocom, was revolutionary, an AI communication platform that could interpret emotional subtexts and messages and predict response patterns. He developed it originally to help children with autism, inspired by a foster brother who struggled with social cues. The market potential was enormous, but Neil had bigger plans. While Olivia spent late nights at the office with Jackson, Neil was methodically building his platform and researching Preston Technologies' vulnerabilities. Richard had built his empire through ruthless acquisition of smaller companies, leaving broken lives in his wake. Neil discovered that Preston Technologies' new flagship product, coincidentally managed by Jackson, had significant security flaws. One rainy night, Neil tracked Olivia to a boutique hotel downtown. Instead of confronting her, he sat in his car, rain hammering the roof, and called his only ally, Dominic Walsh, a former cybersecurity specialist who'd been ruined by Richard Preston years ago. "You sure about this path, Neil?" Dominic's gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "Once you start, there's no going back." Neil watched as Jackson kissed Olivia in the hotel lobby. They've already decided my fate, Don. I'm just changing the ending. In his modest apartment-turned-office, Dominic had helped Neil establish connections with legitimate investors while simultaneously mapping the Preston Empire's digital infrastructure. They discovered Richard's company had been built on stolen intellectual property and tax evasion schemes. Meanwhile, Neil maintained his facade as the struggling husband. He endured family dinners where he was treated as an afterthought, watched as Jackson integrated himself into his family life, and noticed how Olivia grew increasingly distant. Except when she needed money for household expenses that somehow included hotel rooms and lingerie Neil never saw. The breaking point came when Neil found divorce papers in Olivia's desk drawer, already signed and dated. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. The custody arrangement would limit his access to Mia to 1 week into month. That night, Neil finalized his deal with tech giant Global Sphere, selling Neil Acom for $200 million with a stipulation that the acquisition remained confidential until after Thanksgiving. What no one knew was that Neil had been recording everything. Every insult from the Prestons, rendezvous between Olivia and Jackson, background deal at Preston Technologies. And with his new resources, he hired a team of private investigators to dig deeper into the Preston family's carefully constructed image. As Thanksgiving approached, Neil maintained his humble persona while quietly moving his assets and implementing the infrastructure for his revenge. The Prestons saw only what they expected to see. A failure, a nobody. But in the shadows, Neil was architecting their downfall with precision that would have impressed even Richard Preston. The night before Thanksgiving, Neil tucked Mia into bed. "Daddy, why doesn't Grandpa like you?" she asked innocently. Neil smoothed her hair. "Sometimes people can only see what's on the surface, sweetheart. But it's what's inside that matters." "I know what's inside you, Daddy," Mia said sleepily. "You're a good person." Neil kissed her forehead, his resolve strengthening. What he was about to do wasn't just for him anymore. It was for Mia to show her that no one had the right to determine another person's worth. Chapter 3: Beneath the Surface. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Neil received a call from Zoe Blackwood, his estranged older sister. After their parents' death, they've been separated in the foster system. Zoe had aged out before Neil and disappeared, leaving him to navigate the system alone. Her sudden reappearance was unexpected. "I've been watching you, little brother," Zoe said when they met at a quiet cafe. Now a successful criminal defense attorney, she'd been tracking Neil's life from afar. The Prestons have a reputation in legal circles. They destroy people for sport. Neil studied his sister. Hard edges and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Why come back now?" "Because I recognize the look in your eyes. You're planning something." Zoe leaned forward. "Whatever it is, you'll need legal protection." Neil hesitated, then shared portions of his plan. Zoe's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with approval and concern. "Richard Preston represented the company that manufactured the faulty brakes on our parents' car," Zoe revealed. "He buried the evidence. That's why I became a lawyer." This new information cemented Neil's resolve. The Prestons hadn't just insulted him. They were indirectly responsible for the trajectory of his entire life. Meanwhile, Olivia's behavior grew increasingly suspicious. Neil discovered she'd been transferring money from their joint account to a separate one. Through his surveillance, he learned she and Jackson planned to leave the country after Thanksgiving with Mia, using Neil's anticipated absence from the family dinner as an opportunity to implement their plan. What Olivia didn't know was that Neil had already spoken with a different attorney specializing in family law. With evidence of Olivia's affair, financial manipulation, and documented instances of the Prestons' psychological abuse, he built a case for full custody. The weekend before Thanksgiving, Neil took Mia camping. Something the Prestons considered beneath them. Understand-filled skies. Neil helped Mia identify constellations. "Daddy, why does Mommy spend so much time with Uncle Jackson?" Mia asked unexpectedly. Neil chose his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make complicated choices. I heard Grandma say you're not good enough for us." Mia continued. "But she's wrong. You're the best daddy." Neil hugged his daughter tightly. "No matter what happens, I'll always be there for you. Promise me you'll remember that." When they returned home, Olivia was furious about the impromptu camping trip. "You took her without asking me? My father was right about you. You're irresponsible and selfish." Neil remained calm. "Is there something important I should know about Thanksgiving, Olivia?" She faltered momentarily before composing herself. "Just be ready by 4. And try to wear something presentable for once." That night, Neil finalized arrangements with Global Sphere. The company would announce their acquisition immediately after Thanksgiving, installing Neil as head of innovation with a corner office in their Manhattan headquarters. He also confirmed details with his legal team and private investigators who had compiled an irrefutable dossier on Prest and Technology's illegal activities. Dominic called with crucial information. Jackson's been embezzling from Prest and Technologies to fund a secret venture with Olivia. Richard doesn't know his golden boy has been siphoning millions. This was the missing piece. Neil's plan wasn't just about exposing an affair. It was about revealing the rot at the core of the Prest and legacy. Jackson wasn't just sleeping with Neil's wife. He was betraying his mentor. The day before Thanksgiving, Neil received the final divorce papers from Olivia's attorney. The terms were brutal. She wanted everything, including full custody. Neil signed them with a steady hand, adding a small, almost imperceptible amendment that would become significant later. That evening, as Olivia packed overnight bags that seemed excessive for a family dinner, Neil sat with Mia and gave her a small, custom-coded digital device. "This is very special technology, sweetheart. If you ever feel scared or confused tomorrow, press this button and I'll know you need me." Mia examined the device with curiosity. "Is it like a superhero signal?" Neil smiled. "Something like that. It's our secret, okay?" As Thanksgiving Day dawned, Neil dressed with unusual care. Selecting an expensive suit he'd recently purchased rather than his typical modest attire. The fabric felt foreign against his skin, but it was armor for the battle ahead. Olivia looked surprised. "Where did you get that?" "I have my resources," Neil replied mildly. "Shall we go? I wouldn't want to keep your family waiting." Chapter 4. The gathering storm. Thanksgiving Day arrived with a bitter chill that matched the atmosphere inside the Preston mansion. The house was decorated with ostentatious fall arrangements that cost more than Neil's monthly rent from before his windfall. Crystal gleamed, silver shone, and the air was thick with the aroma of gourmet dishes prepared by hired chefs. Neil entered with Olivia and Mia, immediately noting how Jackson was already there. Positioned like he belonged, Richard clapped Jackson's shoulder with fatherly pride while barely acknowledging Neil's existence. "Ah, the whole family's here," Richard announced, his emphasis on family clearly excluding Neil. "Though some additions are more welcome than others." Vivian guided Olivia and Mia toward the parlor, deliberately stepping between Neil and his daughter. "Neil, why don't you make yourself useful in the kitchen? The staff could use another pair of hands." Before Neil could respond, Richard's business associates arrived, powerful figures in technology and finance. These were the people who dismissed Neil's early pitches for Neurocom funding, claiming his background wasn't prestigious enough. Now they laughed and drank expensive bourbon, oblivious to his presence. In the kitchen, Neil observed the family dynamics from a different angle. He overheard the house staff's hushed conversations about poor Mr. Blackwood and how the Mrs. and Mr. Lloyd aren't even trying to hide it anymore. Neil's phone vibrated, a message from Dominic. "All systems go. Global Sphere announcement set for 5 p.m. Legal team standing by." A kitchen staff member approached Neil. "Sir, you don't need to be here. Mr. Preston doesn't like guests in the kitchen." "I'm hardly a guest," Neil replied with a wry smile. "More like background furniture." When Neil returned to the gathering, he found Jackson entertaining Neil with stories about the European trip he was planning. The trip that, unbeknownst to Neil, was supposed to include Olivia and Mia, but not him. "You love Paris, Princess," Jackson was saying. "The museums, the culture. It's important for a Preston to experience the finer things." "But I'm a Blackwood," Mia corrected, catching Neil's eye across the room. Jackson's smile tightened. "Well, we can fix that, can't we?" Throughout the afternoon, Neil maintained his composure despite mounting provocations. Richard accidentally spilled wine on Neil's suit. Vivian loudly discussed Olivia's unfortunate first marriage as if Neil weren't present. Jackson made thinly veiled references to becoming Mia's stepfather soon. At precisely 4:30 p.m., as staff began serving dinner, Neil received another text from Dominic. "Perimeter secure, packages delivered." The packages were evidence files sent to every guest's email, scheduled for delivery during dinner. Each contained different information relevant to the recipient. For Richard's business associates, proof of his fraudulent practices; for extended family, documentation of Richard's betrayals of their trust; for Olivia, evidence of Jackson's numerous other affairs. As everyone took their seats at the massive dining table, Richard stood to give his annual Thanksgiving speech. Neil was seated at the far end, separated from Olivia and Mia. We gather to give thanks for our prosperity and family, Richard began pompously. Some of us have earned our place at this table through hard work and intelligence. His gaze flicked dismissively toward Neil. Others? Well, we tolerate their presence temporarily. Neil noticed Mia's lower lip trembling. Olivia squeezed her hand in warning, but the girl's eyes filled with tears. In the coming year, Richard continued, we'll see some necessary changes in our family structure. Some pruning of dead weight, if you will. The dinner proceeded with excruciating formality. As dessert was served, Richard addressed Neil directly for the first time. I understand you've been developing some sort of computer application, Neil. How's that little hobby going? Still draining my daughter's resources. Before Neil could answer, Dale chimed in. Let's be honest, Richard. Some men just aren't cut out for success. They're, what's the phrase, worthless trash. The table fell silent except for Vivian's poorly disguised laughter. Even some of the guests looked uncomfortable. Mia suddenly stood up, her small face flushed with anger. My daddy is not trash. He works harder than anyone. Mia, sit down, Olivia hissed mortified. No, Mia's voice grew stronger. Daddy just sold his app for $200 million. He told me not to tell, but you're being mean to him. The room froze. All eyes turned to Neil, who calmly set down his napkin. Is this some kind of joke? Richard demanded. Neil smiled for the first time that day. Neil Recombe was acquired by Global Sphere this morning. The announcement goes public in. He checked his watch, approximately 5 minutes. The look on Richard's face was worth every insult Neil had endured. But Neil wasn't finished. What my brilliant daughter didn't mention is that Neurocom's technology is revolutionary enough that Global Sphere has also appointed me as their new Chief Innovation Officer. Neil stood slowly, which means, Richard, that, as of Monday, I'll be your company's largest competitor's newest executive. Funny how life works out, isn't it? As smartphones around the table began buzzing with email notifications, the packages being delivered, Neil looked directly at Olivia and Jackson. I believe this changes our arrangement somewhat, doesn't it? Chapter 5, Revelations and Reckonings. The press and dining room erupted into chaos. Guests frantically checked their phones as Neil's packages arrived, each containing meticulously selected information. Richard's business associates turned action as they discovered evidence of his fraudulent practices. Extended family members gasped at revelations of Richard's betrayals. Olivia stared at her phone in horror, scrolling through proof of Jackson's numerous affairs, including one with Richard's young assistant. What's the meaning of this? Richard roared, his own phone displaying documents revealing that Prest and Technology's flagship security software contains stolen code, Neil's code, which he'd pitched to them years ago and they'd rejected before developing a similar product. Vivian rushed to her husband's side, her perfectly composed facade cracking as she glimpsed the screen. Richard, is this true? Neil remained standing, calm amid the storm. I believe everyone is discovering some interesting truth this Thanksgiving. Truth has always been in short supply in this house. Jackson lunged across the table toward Neil but was restrained by 2 shocked dinner guests. You hacked our accounts, you bastard. That's illegal. Nothing I've shared was obtained illegally, Neil replied coolly. Digital forensics leaves trails, Jackson. You should know that as Prest and Technology's chief security officer. Though you've been rather preoccupied lately, Neil turned to address the stunned gathering. 3 years ago, I pitched Neurocom to Prest and Technologies. Richard dismissed it as amateur hour, his exact words. 6 months later, Prest and Technologies launched a remarkably similar product. The difference is I kept improving mine while maintaining extensive documentation of my original work. Richard's face purpled. You'll never prove it. I'll bury you in litigation. Actually, came a new voice from the doorway. He can and will prove it. Zoe Blackwood entered the dining room, elegant in a tailored suit, followed by Neil's legal team and 2 federal agents. Richard Preston, I'm Special Agent Carter with the FBI Cybercrime Division, said one of the agents. We have a warrant to seize Preston Technologies servers based on evidence of intellectual property theft and securities fraud. While Richard sputtered in disbelief, Olivia grabbed Mia's arm. We're leaving. Now, I'm afraid not. Neil said quietly, producing the divorce papers Olivia had served him. You might want to read the amendment I added before signing. My lawyers were quite thorough. Olivia scanned the document, her face draining of color. In accepting Neil's amendment, she had unwittingly agreed to a complete reversal of the custody arrangement. with Neil receiving primary custody based on evidence of her planned parental abduction. You can't do this, she guessed. Actually, he can, confirmed Zoe. Plotting to take a child out of the country without the other parent's consent is parental kidnapping. We have your tickets, Olivia. One way to Switzerland, leaving tomorrow morning. Jackson backed away from Olivia. I don't know what she's talking about. This was all her idea. The ultimate betrayal. Jackson throwing Olivia under the bus to save himself. Played out exactly as Neil had predicted. Richard collapsed into his chair. The empire he'd built crumbling around him. This is absurd. I'm Richard Preston. Do you know who I am? Yes, Neil replied simply. You're the man who called me worthless trash this morning. You're also the man who represented Veloci Motors when they covered up the faulty brake system that killed my parents 15 years ago. A stunned silence fell over the room. How did you, Richard, begin? My sister is very good at her job, Neil nodded towards Zoe. Finding buried evidence is her specialty. Vivian turned on her husband. You said the case was settled confidentially. You promised there would be no blowback. The statute of limitations on the criminal charges has expired. Zoe explained coolly. But the civil liability hasn't. As of this morning, we filed a $50 million wrongful death suit against both Veloci Motors and Preston Legal Services for conspiracy to obstruct justice. As federal agents began documenting the scene and taking statements, Neil walked calmly to Mia, who was watching everything with white eyes. Are you okay, sweetheart? He asked gently. She nodded slowly. Is Mommy in trouble? Adult trouble, Neil assured her. But you and I are going to be fine. Olivia, desperate and cornered, played her last card. Mia, honey, tell Daddy you want to stay with Mommy. Tell him, Neil Ten said, prepared for his daughter's loyalty to be tested. But Mia looked between her parents and said clearly, I want to go home with Daddy. As Neil prepared to leave with Mia, Richard called out hoarsely. This isn't over, Blackwood. No one does this to me. Neil turned back one last time, surveying the wreckage of the Preston family's carefully constructed facade. You're right about one thing, Richard. This isn't over. It's just beginning. Outside, as Neil buckled Mia into his car, Dominic pulled up in a second vehicle. Global Sphere's announcement just broke. It's trending on every financial news outlet. Neil nodded. Phase 1 complete. Let's go home. As they drove away from the Preston estate, Neil knew the battle was far from over. Richard pressed and wouldn't go down without a fight. And Olivia wouldn't surrender custody easily. But for the first time since he'd married into the Preston family, Neil was fighting on equal ground. That night, as he tucked Mia into bed in their modest home, which would soon be replaced by something safer and more secure, she asked, Are we rich now, Daddy? Neil brushed her hair from her forehead. Money isn't what makes people rich or poor. Sweetheart, it's who they're inside. Then you've always been the richest person I know. Mia said sleepily. Neil kissed her good night, then went to his office where Zoe and Dominic waited with updates. The real war was just beginning. Chapter 6, Count to Moves. 2 days after Thanksgiving, the Preston Empire began its calculated counterattack. Richard Preston may have been bloodied, but he was far from defeated. As Neil had anticipated, Richard leveraged his considerable influence to fight back on multiple fronts. First came the media blitz. Preston-friendly news outlets portrayed Neil as a vindictive, opportunistic husband who had used underhanded tactics to steal intellectual property. Business commentators questioned Global Sphere's decision to acquire Neurocom, suggesting the technology was overvalued and the deal had been rushed. Next came legal maneuvers. Despite the FBI investigation, Preston Technologies filed an emergency injunction claiming Neurocom contained proprietary code. Though baseless, the legal challenge temporarily paused the final phase of Global Sphere's acquisition, leaving Neil in limbo. Most painfully, Olivia filed for emergency reconsideration of the custody agreement, claiming Neil had coerced her signature and manipulated Mia against her. The court date was set for the following week. Neil, Zoe, and Dominic gathered in Neil's new temporary office at Global Sphere headquarters, planning the response. Richard's called in every favor he has. Zoe reported scanning legal documents. 3 judges recused themselves before this landed with Judge Winters. Winters, Neil frowned. Is that good or bad for us? Unknown, Zoe replied. She's notoriously by the book, which could work in our favor given the evidence. But Preston's reach is extensive. Dominic's laptop displayed real-time monitoring of the digital attacks against Neil. They're hitting us from every angle, trying to access your personal accounts, Global Sphere's internal networks, even Mia's school records. They're desperate, Neil observed. Which means they're dangerous. The most unexpected development came when Jackson Lloyd reached out to Neil, requesting a private meeting. Against Zoe's advice, Neil agreed, arranging to meet at a public restaurant with security cameras. Jackson looked haggard when he arrived. His usual polished appearance diminished. "I want to make a deal." Neil regarded him coolly. "I'm listening." "Richard's going scorched earth," Jackson explained. "He's planning to destroy you, Olivia. Me. Anyone he needs to sacrifice to protect himself. He's having documents altered, witnesses pressured, evidence fabricated, and you're suddenly concerned about justice." Neil's voice dripped with skepticism. Jackson leaned forward urgently. "I'm concerned about survival. Richard has recordings of me discussing intellectual property theft. He's going to frame me as the mastermind to save himself. So you admit you stole my code?" Under Richard's direct orders, Jackson confirmed. "I have proof, recordings, emails, the original directives. I kept everything as insurance." Neil studied the man who'd been sleeping with his wife and planning to take his daughter away. "Why come to me instead of the FBI?" "Because you understand how Richard operates. The FBI doesn't." Jackson slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything's here. Use it however you want. I just want immunity. That's not mine to give. Then protection." Jackson amended. "When this goes public, Richard will come after me. Hard." Neil pocketed the drive. "I'll consider it. But understand this. My priority is protecting my daughter. Nothing else matters. There's one more thing," Jackson said as Neil stood to leave. "About Olivia. She wasn't just having an affair. She was helping Richard access your home computer. They've been monitoring your work for years." This revelation, though shocking, aligned with patterns Neil had noticed. Unexplained system glitches. Olivia's sudden interest in his work schedule. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined. Back at Global Sphere, Neil's team analyzed Jackson's evidence. It was genuine and damning. Detailed records of Richard's systematic theft of intellectual property from numerous developers. Not just Neil. "This changes everything," Zoe said. "With this evidence, we can counter Preston's legal challenges and potentially expand the federal investigation to include pattern and practice violations." Meanwhile, Olivia launched her own offensive. She released tearful interviews claiming emotional abuse and manipulation, portraying herself as a victim of Neil's revenge plot. She secured a temporary restraining order preventing Neil from discussing the case publicly, effectively silencing his defense, while she controlled the narrative. Most alarmingly, Neil discovered through Dominic's monitoring that someone had attempted to access Neil's medical records, possibly laying groundwork for claims about Neil's fitness as a parent. That evening, Neil received an unexpected visitor, Vivian Preston, arriving alone at his apartment. "You've turned my family upside down," she said without preamble when Neil let her in. "Your family did that themselves," Neil replied calmly. "What do you want, Vivian?" She studied the modest apartment that Neil had maintained despite his newfound wealth, a strategic decision to appear unthreatening during the custody proceedings. "Richard is imploding," Vivian said finally. "He's making irrational decisions, alienating allies. This vendetta against you has become his obsession and you're concerned about self-preservation," Vivian answered honestly. "Richard's tactics will destroy what's left of the Preston name. I have my own future to consider." Neil perceived the opening. "What are you proposing?" "A ceasefire. I convinced Richard to drop the intellectual property claims and custody challenges. You agree not to pursue additional civil charges against the family." "Why would I agree when I'm winning?" Neil asked. Vivian's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly. "Because Richard is planning something drastic involving me. I don't know details, but he mentioned leveraging the child in a phone call. Whatever it is, I want no part of it." I formed in Neil's veins. "If anything happens to my daughter, it won't if you accept my proposal," Vivian interrupted. "I still have influence with Richard. I'll need more than vague assurances." "Then how about this?" Vivian produced a folder containing original documents showing Richard's systematic tax evasion schemes. "My insurance policy. Now it's yours." After Vivian left, Neil immediately enhanced security around Mia and her school. He hired former Special Forces operators for protection and installed cutting-edge security systems. Whatever Richard was planning, Neil would be ready. The custody hearing approached rapidly. Neil's team prepared meticulously, assembling evidence of Olivia's affair, her planned abduction of Mia, and her collaboration with Richard to monitor Neil's work. But Neil remained unsettled by Vivian's warning. The night before the hearing, Neil sat with Mia as she prepared for bed in their secure apartment. "Daddy, are you and Mommy fighting because of me?" she asked, breaking Neil's heart. "No, sweetheart. Never because of you." Neil chose his words carefully. Sometimes adults make complicated choices, and then they have to deal with the results of those choices. "Mommy called yesterday," Mia revealed. "She said I should tell the judge I want to live with her." Neil maintained his composure despite his anger at Olivia's manipulation. "What do you want?" Mia thought for a moment. "I want everybody to stop being angry. But I want to stay with you. Then that's what we'll fight for," Neil promised, tucking her in. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's an important day." After Mia fell asleep, Neil received an encrypted message from Dominic. "RP making moves. Financial transfers to unknown accounts. Multiple burner phones activated. Something's happening." Neil alerted his security team and settled in for a sleepless night, knowing the next day would determine not just custody of Mia, but the final outcome of his long game against the Prestons. What he didn't know was that Richard Preston had indeed planned one final, desperate counter-move. One that would force Neil to decide what victory truly meant. Chapter 7, Judgment Day. The courthouse bustled with activity as Neil arrived with Mia and their legal team. News of the high-profile custody battle between the newly minted tech millionaire and his socialite wife had drawn media attention, with reporters clustering at the entrance. Neil kept Mia close, shielding her from cameras as they navigated inside. Olivia arrived separately with her legal team and a surprising addition. Richard Preston himself, looking diminished, but determined. Neil noted Richard's uncharacteristically disheveled appearance and the feverish intensity in his eyes. Danger radiated from him like heat from asphalt. In the courtroom, Judge Winters, a stern woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, called the proceedings to order. "This court will not become a circus," she announced firmly. "We are here to determine what arrangement best serves the child's interests, nothing more." Neil's attorney presented their case methodically. Evidence of Olivia's affair, the planned parental abduction, her collaboration with Richard to spy on Neil's work. Most damning was testimony from Mia's therapist, who described the emotional impact of Olivia's increasing absences and the stability Neil provided. When Mia was interviewed privately in the judge's chambers, Neil felt physically ill with worry. Despite their preparation, Mia was still a child facing tremendous pressure. However, when she emerged, her small smile at Neil suggested the conversation had gone well. Olivia's team mounted an aggressive defense, portraying Neil as an obsessive husband who had manufactured evidence out of jealousy. They presented Neil's meticulous documentation as evidence of pathological behavior rather than protection. Mr. Blackwood orchestrated an elaborate revenge scheme, Olivia's attorney argued. His sudden wealth has only enabled toxic controlling behaviors. The judge remained inscrutable throughout, asking pointed questions of both sides. During a recess, Neil received an urgent text from Dominic, security breach at Mia's school. Someone accessed her records using Olivia's credentials. Neil immediately alerted his attorney, who requested an emergency sidebar with the judge. When proceedings resumed, Judge Winters addressed the court with evident displeasure. "I've been made aware of potential tampering with evidence related to this case. This court will recess until tomorrow while these allegations are investigated." As people began filing out, Richard approached Neil directly, ignoring the attorney's attempts to separate them. "You think you've won?" Richard hissed, his breath sour with stress. "But you've miscalculated, Blackwood. Some things matter more than money or reputation." Before Neil could respond, Zoe intervened, physically placing herself between them. "Not another word, Richard. Save it for tomorrow." Outside the courthouse, Neil's security team reported suspicious individuals monitoring the building exits. Taking no chances, they used a secondary exit and decoy vehicles to transport Neil and Mia safely to a secure location, not Neil's apartment, but a Global Sphere executive suite that had been hardened against surveillance and intrusion. That evening, while Mia watched movies with a security detail, Neil, Zoe, and Dominic strategized. "Richard's planning something major," Dominic reported, reviewing surveillance feeds, large cash withdrawals, communications with known fixers. Unusual movements of Prest and Technology's security personnel. He mentioned things that matter more than money or reputation, Neil recalled. He's desperate enough to try something illegal. We should request additional court security tomorrow, Zoe suggested. As they talked, Neil's secure phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. Cautiously, he answered on speaker. Neil, it was Vivian Preston's voice, uncharacteristically shaky. Richard knows I'm with you. He's not rational anymore. He's talking about removing obstacles permanently. Neil's blood ran cold. Where are you now? A hotel. I left after he. Her voice broke. He has a plan for tomorrow. Something about making sure you lose everything that matters. I think he means Mia. After the call, Neil's team implemented crisis protocols, relocating Mia to a different secure location with additional guards, alerting law enforcement about potential threats, and preparing contingencies for the next day's court appearance. Neil barely slept, reviewing security footage from the building's cameras and mentally gaming out every possible scenario for Richard's threat and move. By morning, they had hardened their defenses as much as possible, while still maintaining the appearance of normal court proceedings. As Neil prepared to leave for court, Mia hugged him tightly. Are you scared, Daddy? Neil knelt to her level. A little, but being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. I'm brave too, Mia declared. And I want to go to court with you. After careful consideration, Neil's team decided that keeping Mia with them, surrounded by security, was safer than leaving her elsewhere, potentially exposing her to whatever Richard had planned. At the courthouse, security was visibly enhanced. Judge Winters had been briefed about potential disruptions, and additional court officers were present. Olivia arrived looking tense, but Richard was nowhere to be seen. Where's your father? Neil asked Olivia in a rare direct exchange. I don't know, she admitted, genuine concern in her voice. He wasn't at the house this morning. The proceedings began with Judge Winters addressing the tampering allegations. This court has confirmed unauthorized access to the child's school and medical records yesterday. Ms. Preston Blackwood, your credentials were used in this breach. Olivia looked genuinely shocked. That's impossible. I never. Nevertheless, the judge continued. This tampering appears aimed at fabricating evidence of parental neglect or none exists. As the judge spoke, Neil noticed movement at the courtroom door. Richard Preston entering furtively, his hand concealed in his jacket pocket. Neil's security detail noticed simultaneously, subtly shifting positions. Judge Winters was preparing to announce her ruling when Richard suddenly moved forward, withdrawing his hand from his pocket. Neil's security reacted instantly, but not before Richard revealed what he was holding. Not a weapon, but a thumb drive. Your Honor, Richard called out, his voice unsteady. Critical evidence has been withheld from this court. Court officers intercepted Richard, but the judge motioned them to bring him forward. Mr. Preston, you are not a party to these proceedings. I have evidence proving Neil Blackwood is unfit to parent. Richard insisted, waving the drive. Security footage showing him planning corporate espionage with known criminals. The judge accepted the drive cautiously. This court will review any legitimate evidence. But I warn you, Mr. Preston, if this is a delay tactic or fabrication, there will be severe consequences. While the court took a brief recess to review the material, Neil conferred urgently with his team. He's desperate. Whatever is on that drive, it's either heavily doctored or completely fabricated. Zoe nodded grimly. But a skilled enough edit can be convincing until properly analyzed, which could delay the judge's decision. When court resumed, Judge Winters' expression was thunderous. Mr. Preston approached the bench. Richard moved forward, a triumphant smile forming, until the judge spoke. The material you've presented contains obvious digital manipulation. Timestamps are inconsistent. Audio has been spliced and background show evidence of composite editing. She held up the drive with evident disgust. This court does not appreciate attempts to pervert justice through fabricated evidence. Richard's face contorted with rage. You don't understand. He destroyed everything I built. He removed Mr. Preston from my courtroom. The judge ordered sharply. As court officers moved to escort Richard out, he broke away, lunging toward Neil. You think you've won? I still have one move left. Security restrained him quickly, but Neil felt ice in his veins. Whatever Richard's one move was, it hadn't happened yet. Judge Winters, visibly angered by the disruption, delivered her ruling immediately. Based on the preponderance of evidence, this court grants primary physical custody of Neil Blackwood to her father, Neil Blackwood, with supervised visitation rights for Olivia Preston Blackwood, pending completion of family counseling. As the judge continued outlining the details of the arrangement, Neil's security detail received an alert and immediately surrounded Mia. Simultaneously, Dominic burst into the courtroom, rushing to Neil's side. "It's a diversion," he whispered urgently. "Richard has a second team targeting the school, planning to claim Mia using falsified emergency contact information." Neil's relief at winning custody instantly transformed into cold determination. Richard's one move had been planned regardless of the court outcome, an illegal attempt to take Mia by force, using the court appearance as misdirection. But Neil had anticipated this possibility. The school had been warned, security protocols enhanced, and staff briefed on verification procedures. Richard's team would find not a vulnerable child but a waiting police response. As they exited the courthouse, Neil saw Olivia standing alone, watching as Richard was placed in a police vehicle for his courtroom outburst. For a moment, their eyes met, and Neil saw something unexpected, a flicker of relief, as if some part of her was glad the charade was ending. Later that day, police arrested 3 men attempting to remove a child from Mia's school using forged documents. The investigation revealed direct payments from Richard Preston to the would-be abductors. That evening, as Neil tucked Mia into bed in their secure temporary home, she asked, "Is it over now, Daddy? Can we go back to normal?" Neil smoothed her hair gently. "Not quite yet, sweetheart. But we're going to build a new normal, even better than before." As Mia drifted off to sleep, Neil received a call from Zoe. Richard's being held without bail on attempted kidnapping charges. Olivia's attorney has reached out about a settlement, and Global Spheres finalized the acquisition. "You're officially CIO starting Monday." Neil looked at his sleeping daughter. Everything that really matters is right here. But deep down, Neil knew the journey wasn't quite complete. True resolution would require one final confrontation, not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but face-to-face with the people who had tried to destroy him. Chapter 8: Reconics. 3 months after the custody hearing, Neil sat in his corner office at Global Sphere headquarters, reviewing quarterly projections for Neurocom implementation. The technology was exceeding performance expectations, with applications expanding beyond communication into security, education, and healthcare. Neil had established a new life rhythm: executive by day, devoted father by evening. He and Mia had moved into a comfortable but not ostentatious home in a secure neighborhood where Mia was thriving at a new school. Neil had insisted on normalcy despite his wealth, wanting Mia to develop genuine connections rather than attract friends impressed by money. His assistant interrupted his work. "Mr. Blackwood, you have visitors." "They don't have an appointment," but she hesitated. "It's Olivia and Vivian Preston." Neil was surprised. He hadn't seen Olivia since the supervised visitations had begun, and those exchanges happened through a court-appointed intermediary. "Send them in," he decided after a moment. Olivia entered first, noticeably changed from the polished socialite he'd married. Her designer clothes were replaced by simpler attire, her imperious bearing diminished. Vivian followed, still elegant but somehow reduced, like a portrait that had faded in strong sunlight. "Neil," Olivia began awkwardly. "Thank you for seeing us." Neil gestured to the seating area. "What can I do for you?" The women exchanged glances before Vivian spoke. Richard's plea agreement was finalized yesterday. 5 years for attempted kidnapping, with additional charges for evidence, tampering, and obstruction of justice. Neil nodded. He'd been kept informed by Zoe. "I'm aware. What you may not know," Vivian continued, "is that as part of the agreement, Richard is surrendering control of Preston Technologies. The board has removed him as CEO and chairman. The company's being restructured," Olivia added. "Most of the executive team is being replaced." Neil studied them carefully, sensing there was more. "And this concerns me how?" Vivian straightened her spine, summoning dignity. "We're here to offer you Preston Technologies." Neil couldn't hide his shock. "Excuse me. The board is looking for a buyer to prevent a complete collapse." Vivian explained. "They're willing to accept a significantly undervalued offer to avoid bankruptcy." "Why come to me? I'm with Global Sphere now." "Because," Olivia said quietly, "you're the only one who truly understands both the company's potential and its flaws. And because it would be fitting poetic justice." Neil leaned back, considering the implications. Acquiring Preston Technologies would give Global Sphere significant competitive advantage and allow Neil to implement Neurocom across a broader platform. It would also complete his triumph over Richard Preston in the most definitive way possible. "This isn't just business for you two," Neil observed. What's really going on? Vivian and Olivia exchanged glances again before Olivia answered. I filed for divorce from Richard. After everything that's happened, I can't be part of that family anymore. What about Jackson? Neil asked, genuinely curious. Olivia's expression hardened. Jackson disappeared to Europe with most of our joint assets the day after Richard's arrest. I was nothing but a convenient means to advance his career. And I've lost everything. Vivian added with surprising candor. My social standing, my financial security. Richard's legal bills have drained our personal accounts. Neil felt no sympathy, but neither did he feel the satisfaction he'd expected. These women had contributed to his humiliation, but they too had been manipulated by Richard's toxic influence. I'll discuss the acquisition possibility with Global Sphere's board, Neil said finally, but I make no promises. As they prepare to leave, Olivia hesitated. Neil, about me, I know I've made terrible mistakes. I let my parents poison me against you, against what really matters. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand why I betrayed the only person who ever truly loved me. Neil remained expressionless. Mia asks about you. The supervised visits are important to her. I want to be better for her. Olivia said softly. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but Mia deserves a mother who puts her first. After they left, Neil contacted Zoe for her assessment of the press and technology's offer. It's legitimate, she confirmed after reviewing the preliminary materials. Richard's legal team is desperate for funds. This could be an extraordinary opportunity. Later that week, Neil visited Richard Preston at the detention center where he awaited transfer to federal prison. The once imposing figure was now diminished. Prison clothes hanging on his frame, eyes hollow with defeat. Come to gloat? Richard asked as Neil sat across from him. I came to understand, Neil replied honestly. You had everything, success, family, respect. Why risk it all to destroy someone you considered beneath you? Richard studied Neil with a flicker of his old intensity. Because you represented something I couldn't control. You came from nothing with no connections, no pedigree. Yet you created something I couldn't. It was intolerable. So you stole my work, insulted me in front of my daughter, encouraged your daughter to betray me, and finally tried to abduct my child. Neil summarized coldly. All because you couldn't stand that I succeeded without your approval. Richard's face contorted briefly before settling into resignation. I built an empire by ensuring no one could challenge me. You weren't just a challenge. You were a reputation of everything I believed about power and worthiness. Neil leaned forward. I'm considering buying what's left of press and technologies. For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Richard's face. Make it horror at the ultimate humiliation. You wouldn't. Actually, I would, Neil replied calmly. But not for revenge. For business. Your company still has valuable assets and talent that could thrive under better leadership. Richard laughed bitterly. So this is how it ends. You take my company, my daughter, my legacy. No, Richard. This is how it begins. Neil corrected him. Neil will know her grandfather made serious mistakes but had the opportunity to make amends. What happens next is up to you. As Neil stood to leave, Richard called after him. Why offer me any chance at redemption? After everything I did, Neil paused at the door. Because ultimately, this was never about you. It was about showing me that our worth isn't determined by others' opinions of us, but by the choices we make when tested. Over the following months, Neil orchestrated Global Sphere's acquisition of Prest in Technology's key divisions. He retained talented employees while implementing comprehensive ethics reforms. The technology that Richard had once dismissed as amateur hour now powered the combined company's most successful products. Olivia continued therapy and gradually earned increased visitation with Mia. Though Neil and Olivia would never reconcile romantically, they developed a functional co-parenting relationship centered on their daughter's well-being. Surprisingly, Vivian Preston found unexpected purpose after her fall from social prominence. Using her insider knowledge of high society's darker aspects, she began working with Zoe's legal team as a consultant on cases involving powerful families abusing their privilege. 1 year after the fateful Thanksgiving dinner, Neil hosted his own Thanksgiving gathering. A blend of chosen family including Dominic, Zoe, and select colleagues who had supported him throughout his journey. Olivia attended briefly to share the holiday with Mia before leaving for her own smaller celebration. As they finished dinner, Mia asked innocently, "Daddy, are you still angry about last Thanksgiving?" Neil considered the question carefully before answering. I'm not angry anymore, sweetheart. I'm grateful. For what? She asked, puzzled. For discovering what truly matters. Neil explained, looking around at the people who had stood by him. Not money or status or what others think of you, but being true to yourself and protecting those you love. Later that evening, after guests had departed and Mia was asleep, Neil sat in his home office reviewing a letter he'd received from Richard Preston. The former magnate, now serving his sentence, had begun writing monthly letters, not asking for favors or forgiveness, but reflecting on his failures as a businessman, father, and human being. Neil placed the letter in a folder with the others. Not for his own benefit, but for Mia's. Someday, when she was older, she would understand the full story of how her father had been dismissed as worthless trash by people who measured worth only in dollars and status. And she would learn how he had proven that true value comes not from external validation but from inner integrity. A lesson worth far more than $200 million. Chapter 9, Legacy. 5 years after the confrontation that had transformed all their lives, Neil Blackwood stood at the podium in Global Sphere's main auditorium addressing the company's annual innovation conference. Under his leadership as CIO, the merged entity of Global Sphere and the former Preston Technologies have become the industry leader in AI-enhanced communication systems. True innovation, Neil told the assembled engineers, developers, and business leaders, comes not from trying to control the future, but from creating tools that expand human potential. In the front row sat 13-year-old Mia, now a coding prodigy in her own right, her proud smile illuminating the room. Beside her sat Zoe, now Global Sphere's chief legal counsel, and Dominic, who headed the company's cybersecurity division. After the presentation, as attendees networked over refreshments, Neil was approached by a familiar face, Jackson Lloyd, considerably less polished than in his Preston Technologies days. Quite a success story, Jackson commented, gesturing around the impressive space. I always knew you had potential. Neil regarded him coolly. Did you need something, Jackson? The man shifted uncomfortably. Actually, yes. I'm launching a new venture in ethical AI applications. I was hoping to discuss potential collaboration. Neil almost laughed at the audacity. You betrayed everyone who ever trusted you. Richard, Olivia May. What makes you think I'd ever work with you? People change, Jackson insisted. The past 5 years have been educational. I've learned from my mistakes. Neil studied him skeptically. Submit your proposal through proper channels. If your technology has merit, our team will evaluate it objectively, without your involvement. Jackson's face fell. You're still punishing me for the past. No, Neil corrected him. I'm making a business decision based on character assessment. There's a difference. Across the room, Neil spotted Olivia arriving to pick up Mia. Their relationship had evolved into a functional co-parenting arrangement. Olivia had rebuilt her life as a child advocacy counselor. Work that seemed to provide the purpose her privileged upbringing had never given her. How was the presentation, she asked Mia, hugging her. That was awesome, Mia exclaimed. He talked about the new educational platform we're developing for kids with learning differences. Neil approached them. We're still in development phase, but Mia's ideas about the user interface have been invaluable. Olivia smiled genuinely. She talks about nothing else these days. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. Their conversation was interrupted by Neil's assistant. Mr. Blackwood, the Preston Scholarship recipients are ready for the photo session. The Preston Scholarship Fund, established by Neil 3 years earlier, provided full education funding for foster children pursuing careers in technology. Named deliberately to transform the Preston legacy from one of privilege to one of opportunity, it had already supported dozens of promising students from backgrounds similar to Neil's. As Neil excused himself, Olivia touched his arm lightly. I never properly thank you. For what? Neil asked, surprised. For not destroying my family completely when you could have. She glanced toward Mia, who was chatting animately with Zoe. Richard made terrible choices, but your restraint allowed Mia to eventually have a relationship with her grandfather. Neil nodded thoughtfully. Richard Preston, released from prison 18 months earlier, had undergone a genuine transformation. While he would never regain his former stature in the business world, he had found unexpected purpose mentoring incarcerated white-collar criminals transitioning back to society. It wasn't for Richard, Neil clarified. It was for Mia. She deserved the chance to know her grandfather once he was willing to see her. And you, as more than extensions of himself. Later that evening, Neil hosted a smaller gathering at his home for the scholarship recipients. As he watched these bright young people, most of whom had overcome significant obstacles, engaging confidently with industry leaders, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Dominic joined him on the balcony overlooking the garden where the reception continued. Thinking about Thanksgiving again? Neil smiled slightly. Not the one you're thinking of. The first one after? Dominic guessed. When you invited all of us misfits instead of going the traditional family route. That was the moment I realized I truly won, Neil admitted. Not because of the money or taking over Preston Technologies, but because I'd built something Richard never managed despite all his resources. A genuine community based on mutual respect. Zoe joined them, champagne in hand. To think it all started with you being called worthless trash. Neil laughed. Best insult I ever received. It clarified everything. As the evening wound down, Neil found Mia sitting alone in his home office looking at an old photograph. Neil, much younger, in his first apartment with his initial coding setup. What are you thinking about, sweetheart? He asked, sitting beside her. I found this while researching for my school biography project, Mia explained. You look so young, but your eyes are the same. That was taken right after I aged out of foster care. Neil told her. Everything I own fit into suitcases, but I was determined to make something of myself. Mia studied the photo thoughtfully. Mom told me something interesting yesterday. She said before you got rich, before Neurocom, you were exactly the same person you are now. Just without the resources to show it. Neil felt unexpected emotion tightening his throat. Your mother has become quite insightful. She also said Grandpa Richard's biggest mistake wasn't the illegal stuff, but not recognizing your value when he first met you. Mia looked up at her father. Is that why you named the scholarship after him, to teach him about recognizing value in unexpected places? Neil smiled at his perceptive daughter. That's exactly right. The greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. As they joined the remaining guests, Neil reflected on the long journey from that Thanksgiving dinner where he'd been dismissed as worthless trash to this moment of genuine fulfillment. The money, the success, the vindication, all were satisfying, but none compared to the quiet pride of raising a daughter who understood that true worth came from character, not circumstances. And when Richard Preston had finally asked, during one of Mia's supervised visits to the prison, what did you say that day of Thanksgiving? After your daughter announced her success? Neil had simply replied, I said, thank you for showing me exactly who you are. Now I can show you exactly who I am. It wasn't the dramatic verbal knockout Richard had expected, but the truth was more powerful. Neil hadn't needed cutting words in that moment. His actions in the months and years that followed had spoken far more eloquently than any retort could have. As the evening concluded and Neil stood in his home surrounded by the community he'd built, brilliant young scholars, loyal friends, and a daughter who embodied the best parts of his journey, he knew he had created the most meaningful response to being called worthless trash. A legacy of recognizing worth where others saw none, of creating value rather than merely accumulating it, and of understanding that true success is measured not by the opinions of others, but by the lives you change along the way. Epilogue 20 years later, the autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the expansive grounds of the Blackwood Innovation Campus. Neil Blackwood, now 62, stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching students traverse the walkways between modernist buildings that housed what had become the world's premier technology education center. His hair was now more silver than brown, subtle lines marking the corners of his eyes, evidence of both laughter and contemplation over the years. Yet his gaze remained as sharp and perceptive as it had been 2 decades earlier when he transformed a personal vendetta into a lasting legacy. Dad, you're doing that brooding by the window thing again. Neil turned to see Mia standing in the doorway. At 33, she was the very image of focused determination. Her mother's striking features tempered by her father's thoughtful eyes. As chief research officer of the Blackwood Foundation, she had taken her father's vision for accessible technology and expanded it in ways even Neil hadn't imagined. Not brooding, Neil corrected with a smile. Reflecting, there's a difference. Well, reflect while walking. The gala starts in an hour, and Mom texted that she's already at the venue helping with last-minute preparations. Neil nodded, collecting the weathered leather messenger bag he still carried despite his considerable wealth, a reminder of humbler beginnings. 20 years, hard to believe it's been that long since the first scholarship class. 20 years, 3,000 graduates, and incalculable impact, Mia added, falling into step beside her father as they left the administrative building. Though I'm still annoyed you wouldn't let the planning committee call it the Neil Blackwood Anniversary Gala. That was never the point. Neil replied simply. Success isn't measured by how many buildings bear your name. They walked in comfortable silence across the campus that had once been the Preston estate. After Richard's death 7 years ago, the property had been transformed into the physical headquarters of the Blackwood Foundation, with the mansion converted into administrative offices and new structures built to house educational and research facilities. Grandfather would have hated this, Mia observed with a hint of irony as they passed a collaborative workspace filled with scholarship students from diverse backgrounds. Actually, I think he came to appreciate it toward the end, Neil countered. People can surprise you, given enough time and reason to change. The most surprising transformation had indeed been Richard Preston's. After serving his prison sentence, he had spent his remaining years working with the foundation, offering cautionary insights about privilege and power to young entrepreneurs. His journey from arrogant tyrant to humbled mentor had been painful but genuine. When pancreatic cancer claimed him at 82, his funeral had been attended by dozens of former scholarship recipients whose lives he had impacted in his final chapter. As they reached the parking area, Neil's autonomous vehicle waited, doors opening as they approached. Zoe's already at the venue, Mia informed him as they settled into the luxurious interior. She's been running interference with the press all morning. Still protecting me after all these years, Neil mused fondly. Zoe had remained Global Sphere's chief legal counsel until retiring 5 years earlier to focus full-time on the Blackwood Foundation's advocacy initiatives. At 67, she had become one of the nation's most respected voices on technological ethics and accessibility. Her early hardships giving her unique perspective on how innovation could either reinforce or dismantle social barriers. As their vehicle navigated the winding road from the campus, Neil's thoughts drifted to Dominic, who would be arriving from Tokyo later that evening. After 15 years as Global Sphere's security chief, Dominic had transitioned to international consulting, helping governments strengthen digital infrastructure against increasingly sophisticated threats. His friendship with Neil had never wavered. Their annual fishing trips a sacred tradition immune to the demands of their respective careers. "Are you nervous about the announcement tonight?" Mia asked, interrupting Neil's reminiscence. Neil considered the question. "Not nervous. Certain. It's the right time." The announcement was Neil's long-planned retirement from active leadership of both Global Sphere and the Blackwood Foundation. At 62, he was an old by modern standards, but after 20 years of building his vision, he was ready to step back and watch others, particularly Mia, take the helm. "The board is still hoping you'll reconsider," Mia noted. "Bernard practically begged me to change your mind." Neil smiled at the mention of Bernard Chun, once a brash young scholarship recipient from Neil's early days as a mentor. Now Global Sphere's formidable CEO. Bernard understands better than most that institutions need fresh perspectives to stay relevant. Besides, I'm not disappearing, just changing roles. The vehicle turned onto the main highway toward downtown, where the anniversary gala would be held at the newly renovated Global Sphere Tower. The building's distinctive helix design, illuminated against the darkening sky, had become an architectural landmark. Its public ground floors housing interactive technology exhibits that drew visitors from around the world. "Heard anything from Jackson recently?" Neil asked, seemingly casual, but watching Mia's reaction carefully. Mia's expression tightened slightly. "He sent another proposal last month. Same basic idea repackaged with Trinity or terminology. I declined professionally but firmly." Jackson Lloyd's post-scandal life had followed a predictable trajectory: failed ventures, increasingly desperate attempts to recapture former glory, and a persistent refusal to acknowledge his own role in his downfall. His latest outreach was just one in a long series of attempts to attach himself to the success of the Blackwood name. He never understood that innovation without integrity is just exploitation with better marketing. Neil observed, "A lesson you drill into every scholarship class," Mia replied with affectionate exasperation. "Along with true worth isn't measured by others' opinions and character outlasts capital. All evidence suggests those lessons bear repeating." Neil said, unperturbed by his daughter's teasing. As their vehicle approached the downtown district, the digital billboard on Global Sphere Tower cycled through images of former scholarship recipients, now accomplished engineers, entrepreneurs, researchers, and educators. These were Neil's true legacy, far more significant than the financial empire he had built. The anniversary Galvanio occupying Global Sphere Tower's spectacular 75th floor observation deck was already bustling with activity when Neil and Mia arrived. Staff made final adjustments to elaborate displays chronicling the Foundation's 20-year journey. While early arrivals, mostly Foundation staff and close associates, conferred in small groups, Olivia spotted them immediately, approaching with the confident grace she had developed in her post-socialite life. At 58, she retained her striking beauty, though the designer clothes and meticulous styling of her present days had given way to a more authentic elegance. Cutting it close as usual, she chided Neil gently before embracing Mia. The governor just called to confirm she'll be here, and 3 more scholarship alumni landed emergency funding for the Mali Education Initiative. Neil nodded approvingly. Olivia's transformation from trophy wife to humanitarian had been among the most profound evolutions in their extended circle. After rebuilding her relationship with Mia, she had channeled her social connections and organizational talents into the Foundation's international initiatives, eventually heading its global education division. "Where's Philip?" Mia asked, referring to Olivia's husband of 12 years, a soft-spoken architecture professor who had designed several of the campus buildings. "Rescuing your grandmother from the catering staff," Olivia replied with a smile. "She's trying to improve their hors d'oeuvres arrangement." Neil glanced across the room to see Vivian Preston, now in her early 80s, but still formidable, gesturing emphatically to a bemused server while Philip attempted diplomatic intervention. Vivian had outlived Richard by 7 years, reinventing herself as the Foundation's most demanding volunteer and, surprisingly, one of its most effective fundraisers. Her journey from social climber to passionate advocate for educational equity had been unexpected but genuine. As Neil moved through the gathering crowd, accepting congratulations and deflecting praise with practiced humility, he was struck by how many lives had intersected with his own since that fateful Thanksgiving dinner 25 years earlier. Former adversaries, skeptical investors, reluctant partners, many had become allies, collaborators, even friends. "There's the man of the hour," called a familiar voice. Zoe approached, immaculate in a tailored suit, her silver hair cropped short in her signature style. "The press is sufficiently managed, though I had to threaten the Tribune with legal action when they tried pushing that revenge to redemption angle again." Neil embraced his sister warmly. "You know they'll never let go of that narrative. It sells too well." "Still," Zoe insisted, "tonight should focus on the students, not ancient history." As if on cue, the first major wave of guests began arriving. Scholarship recipients from every cohort of the program, from established professionals in their 40s to current students barely into their 20s. What struck Neil, as it did every time he saw them together, was the remarkable diversity, not just in ethnicity and gender, but in perspective, specialty, and approach to innovation. Among them was Dr. Lydia Wallace from the very first scholarship class, now a pioneering researcher in Neil interface technology. Her recent breakthrough, allowing nonverbal ALS patients to communicate through thought, had earned her a Nobel nomination. Beside her stood Marco Espinoza, whose educational software platform now reached over 40 million students in underserved communities worldwide. These were the embodiments of Neil's vision. Brilliant minds who might never have reached their potential without the resources and mentorship his foundation provided. Unlike Richard Preston's approach of hoarding knowledge and advantage, Neil had built his legacy on distribution and empowerment. As the event's formal program began, Neil found himself seated between Mia and Dominic, who had arrived from Tokyo looking remarkably unchanged despite his 65 years, still solid, observant, with the quiet alertness that had made him such an effective security chief. Heard about the retirement announcement, Dominic murmured as the Foundation's current executive director delivered opening remarks. "About time. You've been threatening to step back for 5 years now?" 7, Neil corrected with a slight smile. "But there was always one more initiative to launch, one more partnership to solidify." "The founder's trap," Dominic nodded knowingly. "Building something is the easy part, letting others run with it. That's the real challenge." Speeches followed, brief, impactful reflections from scholarship alumni, partners, and educators. Each highlighted different aspects of the Foundation's work, from technological innovation to educational access, from ethical guidelines to community impact. Conspicuously absent was any speaker focusing specifically on Neil himself, per his explicit request. When it was finally Neil's turn to address the gathering, he approached the podium amid thunderous applause, not with the triumphant stride of a conquering hero, but with the measured pace of someone who understood that accomplishment was always collective. 20 years ago he began once the applause subsided. We started with a simple premise that brilliant minds exist everywhere, regardless of background, circumstance, or access to resources. Our job was not to create excellence but to remove the barriers preventing it from emerging naturally. He paused, surveying the faces before him. Former scholarship recipients now changing the world in ways large and small. Collaborators who had helped shape his vision, family members who had supported and challenged him. Many of you know parts of my story, the rejection, the struggle, the eventual vindication. What fewer know is that the foundation wasn't born from success, but from failure, not my failure, but the failure of systems and individuals to recognize that worth isn't determined by pedigree or privilege. Neil's gaze found Mia in the front row, her eyes reflecting understanding of the deeper meaning behind his words. Tonight marks a transition, not just for me personally as I step back from daily operations, but for the foundation itself. Under Dr. Mia Blackwood's leadership as incoming executive chairperson, the Blackwood Foundation will expand beyond technology education into areas we've only begun to explore. Murmurs rippled through the audience. This announcement of Mia's new role have been carefully guarded. Some have called what we've built my legacy, Neil continued. If so, it's a legacy built by thousands of hands, minds, and hearts. My contribution was simply recognizing potential where others saw none. Something anyone can do if they're willing to look beyond surface judgments. As Neil concluded his remarks and the formal program transitioned to celebration, he found himself drawn to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The sprawling metropolis below, with its intricate patterns of light and shadow, reminded him of the complex interconnections that had brought him to this moment. Dad, Mia joined him at the window, champagne fluid in hand. You disappeared after your speech. Everyone's looking for you. Just needed a moment. Neil explained. It's a lot to take in. How far we've come from where we started. Mia studied her father knowingly. You're thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner again, aren't you? When Grandpa called you worthless trash, Neil smiled ruefully. It's strange how pivotal moments stick with you. That insult changed everything. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified what truly mattered. You never told me exactly what you said to him that day. Mia noted. After I announced her app sale, in all these years, whenever the story comes up, you just say you thanked him for showing his true character. That's essentially what happened, Neil confirmed. Big dramatic confrontations make better stories, but real life rarely provides such satisfying climaxes. The real response happened over years, not moments. Mia considered this. I've been thinking a lot about generational patterns lately. How values and behaviors get passed down, sometimes despite our best intentions to change them. Concerned about repeating family history, Neil asked perceptively. Sometimes, Mia admitted. Olivia has pressed in DNA. I do too. What if that sense of entitlement, that blindness to privilege is lurking somewhere in me, waiting to emerge? Neil turned to face his daughter fully. The fact that you're asking the question already sets you apart. Richard never questioned his assumptions until forced to. You've been examining yours since childhood. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tyler Washington, the Foundation's youngest ever scholarship recipient. A 17-year-old quantum computing prodigy from Southside Chicago, whose algorithm had recently solved a decades-old encryption challenge. Dr. Blackwood, the young man addressed Mia with nervous enthusiasm. The team wanted me to ask if you could join us for a photo. We're all current scholarship students, and with your new appointment. Of course, Tyler, Mia agreed warmly. She squeezed her father's arm. Duty calls. Don't disappear again. Dominic is telling the Tokyo airport security story, and you know he embellishes without supervision. As Mia departed with Tyler, Neil returned his gaze to the city below, allowing himself a rare moment of pure satisfaction. The journey that had begun with rejection and revenge had transformed into something far more meaningful than mere vindication. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. You always did prefer watching from the periphery. Neil turned to find Olivia beside him. Her expression thoughtful. Old habits, he acknowledged. Though I've gotten better at mingling over the years. Marginally, Olivia teased, then grew serious. I've been meaning to thank you. For what? For not telling Mia the full truth about those years, about how terrible I was, how completely I betrayed you. Neil considered her words carefully. I never lied to her. She knows we both made mistakes. Your mistakes were tactical. Mine were moral. Olivia countered. You had every right to paint me as the villain in your story. What purpose would that have served? Neil asked. Mia deserved a mother she could respect, and you became someone worthy of that respect. The past is just that past. Olivia nodded. emotion briefly clouding her features. When I think about who I was then, so desperate for my parents' approval that I would sacrifice a good man and risk my daughter's happiness, it feels like a different person entirely. It was, Neil said simply. We're all different people than we were 20 years ago. That's the point of growth. They stood in companionable silence, former spouses who had traveled a long, complicated road to genuine mutual respect. When Richard was dying, Olivia said eventually, he told me something I never shared with you. He said his biggest regret wasn't losing his company or even going to prison. It was failing to recognize what was right in front of him. A brilliant mind unbound by convention, someone who could have been an ally instead of an enemy. Neil absorbed this revelation thoughtfully. He told me something similar in his way. I think he finally understood that his need to control and dominate ultimately limited him far more than it empowered him. A lesson I hope our generation learned thoroughly enough not to pass down, Olivia remarked. Before Neil could respond, Philip approached to collect Olivia for a conversation with potential donors from Europe. As she departed, Neil found himself once again alone with his thoughts until Dominic appeared at his side. Admiring the view or avoiding the crowd, his old friend asked knowingly. Can it be both? Neil replied with a smile. Dominic handed Neil a tumbler of whiskey. 20 years. Hard to believe it's been that long since we first started planning your great revenge. That wasn't what we built, though, was it? Neil mused, accepting the drink. Revenge was just the catalyst for something far more constructive. True enough, Dominic acknowledged. Though I still enjoy remembering Richard Preston's face when he realized you'd outmaneuvered him completely. Neil chuckled softly. There was a certain satisfaction in that moment. But it pales compared to watching Mia today, seeing what she's become, what she'll accomplish next. The gala continued around them. Conversations flowing, connections forming, ideas emerging. This organic exchange of perspective and possibility was exactly what Neil had envisioned when establishing the foundation. A perpetual cycle of innovation fueled by diversity of thought and experience. As the evening drew to a close, with guests gradually departing and staff beginning subtle cleanup, Neil found himself drawn to a display he hadn't noticed earlier. A simple digital frame cycling through photographs from the foundation's history. Among them was an image he hadn't seen in years. Neil and 8-year-old Mia in his modest pre-wealth apartment, surrounded by computer equipment, both intensely focused on a coding problem. That's my favorite picture of us, Mia said, appearing beside him. Before everything changed. Not everything changed, Neil corrected gently. The circumstances changed. The values remained constant. Mia nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about what you said in your speech about recognizing potential where others don't see it. That's what you did with me too. Not just as my father, but as my first teacher. You hardly needed my help. Neil demurred. Your brilliance was obvious from the start. Not to everyone, Mia reminded him. Grandfather initially saw me as just another Preston asset to be molded and controlled. You saw me as a mind to be nurtured and guided. That difference changed everything. As the last guests departed and the event staff completed their work, the Blackwood inner circle gathered for a final, private toast. Neil, Mia, Zoe, Dominic, Olivia, and Philip. They stood together in the now quiet observation deck. City lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. To 20 years of proving that worth isn't determined by others' opinions, Zoe offered, raising her glass. To recognizing value where others see none, added Dominic. To second chances and new beginnings, Olivia contributed softly. To the next 20 years, Philip suggested. Mia raised her glass last. To my father, who taught me that the greatest revenge isn't destruction, but creation. Neil, momentarily overcome, simply nodded his acknowledgement as they clinked glasses. The journey from that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner to this moment of profound accomplishment hadn't been linear or simple. There had been setbacks, challenges, difficult decisions, and necessary compromises. But as he stood surrounded by the family, he had both been born into and created by choice. Neil Blackwood knew with absolute certainty that he had built something far more valuable than wealth or status or vindication. He had constructed a legacy of recognition, of seeing worth in unexpected places and creating systems that allowed that worth to flourish. In the end, being called worthless trash had been the most valuable insult of his life. Not because proving Richard Preston wrong had been satisfying, though it undeniably had been, but because it had catalyzed Neil's most important realization. That true worth was never about external validation, but about the values you upheld, the lives you touched, and the potential you unlocked in others. As the small group prepared to depart, Neil took a final look around the space where they had celebrated 2 decades of transforming an act of revenge into a mission of empowerment. The journey hadn't ended. It had evolved, as all worthwhile journeys do. And whatever came next, Neil knew the foundation of values he had built would endure. Not just in Mia or the scholarship recipients or the technologies they created, but in the fundamental understanding that worth isn't determined by circumstance or perception, but by the impact one creates through integrity, innovation, and the courage to see potential where others see none. In that understanding lay Neil Blackwood's true legacy, one that no insult, no matter how cutting, could ever diminish.